The hall was the largest thing any human had ever built or ever would build, and humans had not built it. The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council sat inside a station called Aethys Prime, a ring of metal and light floating in the deep black between three dead stars. Thousands of species had seats there, thousands of voices, thousands of eyes that were not eyes, ears that were not ears, mouths that had no lips, and spoke in colors, or vibrations, or smells. And somewhere near the bottom, in a small row of seats that could barely hold 6 people, sat the human delegation. Ambassador Han Do-won walked through the corridor toward the chamber, with slow and steady steps. He was not a tall man. He was not a loud man. He had gray hair cut short, and a face full of lines that came from years of watching terrible things and choosing not to look away. He wore a dark suit, with no medals and no decorations. Behind him walked Kang Tae-soo, his chief advisor, a younger man with sharp eyes and a tablet pressed against his chest like a shield. "They already know what we are going to ask," Tae-soo said quietly. "Yes," Do-won replied. "They are going to say no." "Probably." Tae-soo looked at him. "Then why are we here?" Do-won did not answer right away. He stopped walking and looked up at the massive doors of the Grand Chamber. They were 30 meters tall and carved from a stone that did not exist on any human world. He stared at them for a long moment. Then he said, "Because the dead deserve to be spoken for, even in rooms that do not want to hear." They entered. The chamber was already full. Thousands of delegates from hundreds of species filled the tiered seats that rose in great circles toward a ceiling so far above it looked like a false sky. The air smelled like nothing and everything at the same time, because the station filtered and blended the atmospheres of so many worlds. Do-won walked down the long ramp to the human section. He felt the weight of every alien gaze, some curious, some bored, some amused. Humans had been members of this council for 12 years. In galactic terms, they had arrived yesterday. High Arbiter Oluwin called the session to order. He was Bathari, a species made of something like living crystal, tall and translucent, with light moving slowly inside his body like trapped thoughts. His voice came not from a mouth, but from the vibration of his entire frame, deep and heavy, like a bell rung underwater. He was old. Even by Bathari standards, he was ancient. He had overseen this council for longer than humans had known how to make fire. "This emergency session has been called at the request of the human delegation," Oluwin announced. "Ambassador Do-won, you may speak." He walked to the central platform, a circle of light in the middle of the enormous room. He carried a small device in his hand. He pressed it, and the air above him filled with images. The images showed a planet, green and blue, a colony called Hana 7, home to 6,000 people, farmers, teachers, children. Then the images changed. Ships appeared in the sky, dark and jagged, shaped like the legs of insects, pulled apart and welded back together wrong. Kyle warships. The footage showed them landing. It showed soldiers pouring out, tall and armored, with too many limbs and jaws that opened sideways. It showed people running. It showed people not running fast enough. Then the footage showed what was left after the Kyle were done. Empty streets, broken homes, dark stains on the ground that the rain had not yet washed away. Small shoes lying in the dirt, with no feet in them. Do-won let the footage play for a long time. He let the silence do the work. When it ended, he spoke. "In the last 8 months, the Kyle Dominion has attacked 14 human colonies. 40,000 of our people are dead. Families, children, old people who could not run. They were not soldiers. They were not threats. They were living their lives." He paused. "We ask the Council to enforce Article 12 of the Charter of Protected Species, which states that unprovoked aggression against a member world is a violation punishable by collective response." He stopped. He waited. Alun's crystal body flickered faintly, which meant he was thinking, or perhaps that he had already decided, and was only pretending to think. "The Council acknowledges the ambassador's evidence," he said. "However, it is important to consider the full context. The Kyle Dominion has been a member of this council for over 3,000 years. Their relationship with galactic stability is complex. We urge perspective." Dowan felt Tesu tense behind him, but said nothing. Then Trade Legate Desori rose from his seat. He was Malik, a species of tall reptilian creatures with scales the color of wet stone and eyes like 2 drops of black oil. Desori was the richest being in the chamber and possibly the richest being in the galaxy. He smiled, which for a Malik meant pulling back the skin around his jaw to show flat grinding teeth. It was not meant to comfort. "Perhaps," Desori said smoothly, "there is a simpler path. I have spoken with the Kale Dominion, and they are willing to offer a generous arrangement. They will stop all raids on human colonies immediately." He paused for effect. "In exchange, humanity will cede 3 colony worlds in the outer systems, and provide an annual tribute of biological samples for Kale research purposes." The chamber murmured. Many heads nodded. This was how things worked. This was the system. The strong took, the weak gave, and the council called it peace. Dohan stared at Desori for a long time. Desori stared back with those oil-black eyes and waited for gratitude. "We request a 24-hour recess," Dohan said flatly, "before we give our answer." Oluin waved a crystalline hand. "Granted." As they walked back through the corridor toward the shuttle, Tesu leaned close. "You know what Desori is doing. The consortium buys what the KL harvest. They are funding the raids. This whole thing is a business." "I know," Dohan said. Later, aboard the ESS Baekdu, Earth's flagship cruiser, Captain Yoon Nari was waiting. She stood at the viewport of the command deck, arms crossed, watching the massive council station turning slowly against the stars. She was tall and sharp-featured, with her black hair pulled back tight. She had commanded warships for 20 years, and she had never once lost a ship under her watch. She turned when Do Von entered. "What happened in there?" she asked. "They want us to hand over 3 colonies and give the Kyle our people's blood and tissue samples every year. They are calling it a deal." Nari's jaw tightened. "And what did you say?" Do-Hwan walked to the viewport and stood beside her. The council station glittered in the dark, beautiful and enormous, and completely indifferent to the 40,000 names that would never be spoken again. "They want us to negotiate with the people who burned our children alive," he said quietly. "I need to think." Nari said nothing. She just stood beside him and watched the stars, and the silence between them was the kind of silence that comes before a storm that has already decided where it will land. Dohan did not sleep that night. He sat in his quarters aboard the Baekdu with the lights turned low and a holographic projector running footage on the wall in front of him. He had watched it 4 times already, and each time it got worse. Not because the images changed, but because he understood more of what he was seeing. The footage was from Colony Hana 7. It had been pulled from security cameras, personal devices, and 1 emergency drone that had managed to fly for 11 minutes before a Kyle soldier shot it out of the sky. In those 11 minutes, the drone had captured everything. Streets full of people trying to run toward the emergency shelters. Kyle soldiers moving through the crowd like machines, grabbing people, dragging them toward large pods attached to their landing ships. The pods were harvesting units. Dohan had read the technical reports. He wished he did not. In one frame, frozen on the wall, a woman was holding 2 children against her chest. Her face was turned toward the camera, but she was not looking at it. She was looking at something behind her. something coming. The footage ended 3 seconds later. Dohan turned the projector off and sat in the dark for a long time. There was a knock on his door. It was Shin Unji, the combat medic, who had been on the first response team to reach Hana 7 after the Kael left. She was a small woman with steady hands and tired eyes. She had asked to speak with him, and he had agreed because he believed that the people who had seen the worst of something deserved to be heard by the people who had to decide what to do about it. She sat across from him and folded her hands in her lap. She had already done her crying months ago, and what was left was something harder than tears. "We arrived 9 hours after the Kael ships left," she began. "The fires were still burning. The air smelled like metal and something sweet that I will never be able to describe and never be able to forget. We searched every building, every home, every shelter. Most of them were empty, not destroyed, just empty. Clothes on the floor, food still on tables, toys in the yards. 6,000 people, and almost all of them were just gone." She paused and took a slow breath. "I found 13 survivors, 13 out of 6,000. Most of them were hiding in places the Kael did not bother to check. Under floors, inside water tanks. One little boy had crawled inside a broken refrigeration unit and stayed there for 9 hours without making a sound. He was 7 years old. He did not speak for 2 weeks after we found him." Dohan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked, "What do you think we should do?" Unji looked at him and her tired eyes were suddenly very clear. "I think if we give them what they want, then those 13 people survived for nothing. And the 6,000 who did not survive, they become just a number that we traded away for a little more time." After she left, Dohan sat alone again. Then he called Taesu. Taesu arrived carrying his tablet and a cup of something hot that he did not drink. He had been busy. He had spent the last several hours in a private meeting with Envoy Pilon of the Suran, a small avian species with feathers the color of sunset, and large dark eyes that always looked a little sad. Pilon was one of the few alien delegates who had shown genuine sympathy toward humanity, and Taesu had wanted to know why. "Pilon told me something important," Taesu said, sitting down. "The Kael have done this before. Over the last 2,000 years, they have raided at least 5 smaller species the same way they raided us. Every single time, the Council proposed a bargain. Every single time, the smaller species accepted. They gave up colonies, resources, dignity. And every single time, the Kael came back for more. Within a few centuries, those species were reduced to nothing. Vassal states, stripped of everything. Some of them barely exist anymore." Dowan leaned forward. "And the Council allowed this?" "The Council designed it," Taesu said, and his voice was bitter. "Pilon said something I cannot stop thinking about. She said the Council does not keep peace. It keeps order. And order always favors the ones who are already strong." A message arrived on Dowan's personal channel. It was from Trade Legate Dusori. The message was polite and friendly, written in the careful language of someone who was used to buying whatever he wanted. Fewer colonies to surrender. Reduce tribute. He called it a personal gesture of goodwill. He said he admired humanity's courage and wanted to help find a solution that everyone could accept. Taesu read the message and shook his head. He is nervous. Every other species accepted the bargain within hours. We asked for a recess. That has never happened before. He does not know what we are going to do, and it is making him uncomfortable. Dowan read the message one more time, and then deleted it. That evening he gathered the 4 of them in the Baekdu's small conference room. Himself, Taesu, Captain Nari, and Unji. The room had a single round table and no windows. The light was white and flat, and it made all of them look older than they were. Dowan placed both hands on the table and looked at each of them. I want to ask you a question, he said. If we accept this deal, What do we become? Nari answered first. We become what they expect us to be. Obedient, another species that learned its place. Tesu answered next. We become a precedent, proof that the system works, proof that you can kill 40,000 people and buy your way out of it. Unji answered last. We become the people who told those 13 survivors that their lives were worth 3 colonies and a shipping contract. The room was quiet for a moment. Then we do not accept, Doan said. He pulled his datapad toward him and began to write. It did not take long. When he was done, he turned the screen toward the others. On the screen was a single sentence, just 7 words. Tesu read it, and his face went pale. He looked at Doan as if the old man had just pulled the pin from a grenade and set it on the table between them. Nari read it, and a slow, hard smile spread across her face. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a woman who had been waiting for someone to finally say what needed to be said. Unji read it, and tears ran down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from something fiercer. Relief, maybe. Or recognition. The feeling you get when someone puts into words the thing that has been sitting in your chest like a stone for months. Tomorrow, Dohwan said, I walk to the center of that chamber. I say these 7 words, and then I sit back down. No explanation, no negotiation, no apology. Just this. Tesu swallowed. You know what will happen after? Yes. They will come for us. Yes. Nari leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. Then we had better be ready. Dohwan looked at the sentence on the screen one more time. 7 words. The weight of 40,000 lives pressed into 7 words. He turned the datapad off and stood. Get some rest, he said. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. None of them slept. The grand chamber was fuller than it had been in years. Word had traveled fast, the way it always does when something unusual is about to happen. And the unusual thing was this. A junior species was about to give its answer to a Kyle bargain, and it had taken 24 hours to do it. That had never happened before. Every species in galactic history that had been offered a Kyle bargain had accepted within hours. Some within minutes. The smart ones cried quietly and signed the papers. The proud ones made speeches about sacrifice and then signed the papers. But they all signed. So the chamber was full, not because anyone expected a different outcome, but because everyone wanted to see how the humans would surrender. Would they do it with dignity? With anger? Would the ambassador cry? The galaxy loved a good tragedy, especially one that happened to someone else. Commander Vorin of the Kyle Dominion was there in person. He sat in the upper tiers, in a seat that had been specially reinforced to hold his weight. He was enormous, even for a Kale. His exoskeleton was the color of dried blood, and his 4 arms rested on the railing in front of him, like weapons laid across a table. His head was a thing of angles and hard edges, with mandibles that clicked slowly as he watched the floor below. He had come to watch the humans bend. He wanted to see it with his own eyes. Trade Legate Desori sat in the Moloch section, his black eyes moving across the chamber, reading the room the way a merchant reads a market. He was calm. He had done this many times. He had helped broker 7 Kale bargains over his career, and each one had made the consortium richer. This would be no different. The humans would accept. They would give up their colonies. The consortium would process the biological tribute. Business would continue. High Arbiter Alun stood at the center of the raised platform, his crystalline body catching the light and scattering it across the chamber walls in slow-moving patterns. He called the session to order, and the 1,000 conversations happening in 100 languages fell silent. The recess requested by the human delegation has concluded, Alun said, his voice filling the chamber like the sound of deep water moving over stone. Ambassador Dohwan, You may deliver your species' formal response to the proposed agreement. Every sensor, eye, and organ of perception in the chamber turned toward the small human section near the bottom. Do-hwan stood. He did not bring his datapad, he did not bring Taesu, he did not bring notes or documents or evidence. He straightened his dark jacket and stepped out from behind the small desk that served as humanity's station. Then, he began to walk. The central speaking platform was a long way from the human section. The designers of the chamber had placed junior species far from the center, a small reminder of where they stood. Do-hwan walked the entire distance alone. His shoes made a quiet sound on the polished floor, and in the silence of the chamber, that small sound was the loudest thing in the room. Every step echoed. Every step was watched. He reached the platform. A circle of white light surrounded him from above. The same light that had illuminated 10,000 speakers before him, ambassadors and emperors, and war leaders from across the galaxy. He stood in the center of it, a small man in a dark suit, and he looked up. He looked at Alun, standing above him like a tower of glass. He looked at Disori, watching from the merchant's gallery with those flat black eyes. He looked at Vorin, massive and armored, leaning forward in his seat with the confidence of someone who had never once been told no. He looked at all of them, the powerful, the ancient, the ones who had watched 40,000 humans die and called it a negotiation opportunity. He looked at them, and they looked back, and the chamber was so quiet that someone later said you could hear the station's hull creaking as it turned in the void. Do-hwan spoke. His voice was not loud. He did not shout. He spoke the way a man speaks, when he has already made peace with what comes next, and is no longer afraid of any of it. We don't bargain with killers. Then he turned and walked back to his seat. The silence that followed was not the ordinary silence of a room where someone has stopped talking. It was the silence of a room where something has broken. Something that cannot be put back together. Something that everyone felt snap, but no one could point to and say, there, that is where it broke. No species in the history of the Galactic Council had ever refused a mediated bargain. Not in 6,000 years of recorded sessions. Not once. The system was built on the assumption that everyone, no matter how angry, no matter how hurt, would eventually accept the deal. Because the deal was the system, and the system was the galaxy. And you did not say no to the galaxy. Do-hwan had just said no to the galaxy. Vorin was the first to react. He surged to his feet, his massive frame making the reinforced seat groan beneath him. His mandibles split apart, and a sound came from his throat that the universal translators struggled to process. When it finally rendered the words, they came through harsh and jagged. This prey species has made its choice. The Kyle Dominion will triple its operations against human worlds. We will target their core systems. We will harvest every colony they possess until there is not a single human left to make speeches. You have chosen extinction. The chamber erupted. Voices from 100 delegations filled the air. Some were shouting. Some were calculating. Some were already placing bets on how quickly humanity would fall. Oluin struck his staff against the platform 3 times. The sound cut through the noise like a blade. Order, he commanded. The chamber fell to a nervous murmur. Oluin turned his translucent head toward Do-hwan. Light moved inside him, in sharp, unstable patterns. Ambassador, the Council strongly urges you to reconsider. The Charter cannot protect a species that refuses to engage in the diplomatic process. Without an agreement, the Council has no mechanism to intervene. Do-hwan was already seated. He sat with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes forward, and he did not respond. He did not move. He did not blink. The chamber watched him, and for a moment, just a moment, some of them felt something they had not expected. Not pity, not amusement, something colder and older and more uncomfortable. The feeling you get when you realize that the person in front of you is not afraid. And the reason they are not afraid is not because they are stupid, but because they have already decided what they are willing to lose. Then something else happened. Something that no one had planned and no one had predicted. Envoy Pelin of the Suran rose from her seat. She was small, even for her species, with feathers that shimmered between gold and copper. She did not speak. She simply stood. Then a delegate from the Boru stood, a heavy, slow-moving creature with stone-gray skin and 4 thick legs. He said nothing. He just stood. Then an Asani delegate, then a Vrali, then 2 more from species so small that most of the chamber did not even know their names. One by one, 7 delegations from the lowest tiers of the chamber stood in silence. They did not cheer. They did not speak. They did not raise banners or make demands. They just stood and looked up at the powerful and the ancient, and the ones who had never been told no, and their silence said everything that words could not. Alun stared at this, and for the first time in anyone's memory, the light inside his body went still. Disori's black eyes moved from face to face. His grinding teeth were hidden behind closed lips. He was recalculating. Vorin did not care about standing delegates. He was already turning to leave, already planning the fleet movements, already tasting what he would do to the human colonies. The session dissolved. Delegates moved in every direction. The noise was enormous. In the middle of it, Dohan's communicator buzzed. It was Captain Nari aboard the Baekdu. Her voice was steady but tight. Ambassador, Kale warships are mobilizing toward our outer colonies. At least 200 ships. They are heading for Duri 3. Dohan stood and walked toward the exit. As he moved through the chaos of the chamber, he pressed the communicator to his mouth and said one sentence. Then it is time. The galaxy learned what humans do to killers. Colony Duri 3 was the largest human settlement left on the frontier. 18,000 people lived there in a valley between 2 mountain ranges on a world with blue-green skies and long, slow seasons. It had schools and hospitals and farms that grew wheat that tasted almost like the wheat back on Earth. The people there had chosen the frontier because they wanted open land and quiet skies and a chance to build something with their hands. They did not choose to be a target. But the Cal had chosen them anyway, and 200 warships were now burning through space toward their world. Commander Vorin led the fleet himself. He stood on the bridge of his flagship, a massive vessel called the Iron Jaw, and watched the stars stretch and blur as his ships moved at faster-than-light speed. He was not worried. He had destroyed colonies before, many times. It was simple work. You arrived, you overwhelmed whatever small defense existed, you harvested what you needed, and you left. The Council did nothing, because the Council never did anything. That was the beauty of the system. The weak complained, the strong took, and someone like Disori made sure the paperwork was clean. He expected Duri 3 to be the same. A few defense platforms, maybe a handful of patrol ships. Nothing that could stop 200 KL warships. What Vorin did not know was that Captain Yoon Nari had been planning for this moment since long before the council session. She was a woman who believed in a simple rule. Hope for the best and prepare for the worst. And if you only have time for one, always choose the second. The moment the KL raids began 8 months ago, Nari had started moving pieces into place. She had pulled ships from deep patrol routes. She had hidden supply caches in asteroid fields. She had studied every KL battle in the last 500 years, and she had found something interesting. The KL always fought the same way. Their fleet formations were rigid and hierarchical. The strongest ship led from the front. The rest followed in a pattern based on rank and firepower. If the lead ship advanced, they all advanced. If the lead ship turned, they all turned. This made them powerful in a straight fight, because their coordination was absolute. But it also made them predictable, because they could not imagine fighting any other way. Humans could. Humans had spent thousands of years fighting each other before they ever reached the stars. They had invented every kind of warfare there was. They had learned to ambush, to retreat, to deceive, to sacrifice one position to win another. They had learned that appearing weak was sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do, because it made your enemies stop thinking. Nari had 40 ships, 40 against 200. On paper, it was suicide. But paper does not fight wars. The Kaio fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel near Duri 3 and immediately began scanning for threats. What they found confused them. There were only 20 human ships in orbit around the planet. Small ones, light cruisers, and patrol craft arranged in a loose defensive line. Voron's tactical officers reported the numbers, and Voron made a sound deep in his throat that passed for laughter among the Kael. 20 ships, he said. They sent 20 ships to stop us. He ordered the advance. The Kael fleet moved forward in its standard formation, the iron jaw at the front, the rest spreading behind it in a wedge shape that was designed to crush anything in its path. The 20 human ships held position for a moment, and then began to pull back, moving toward the planet's moon, a barren gray rock with deep craters and no atmosphere. Voron saw the retreat. They are running, he told his officers. Follow them. Do not let a single one escape. The Kael fleet surged forward, chasing the retreating human ships around the curve of the moon. The formation stretched as the faster Kael ships pushed ahead, and the slower ones fell behind. The discipline held, but the shape of the fleet changed from a tight wedge to a long, thin line. That was what Nari wanted. The 20 human ships were not retreating. They were pulling, drawing the Kael fleet into the gravity well between the planet and its moon, a zone where navigation was tricky and sharp turns were dangerous, because the gravitational pull made everything heavier and slower. When the Kael fleet was deep in the gravity well, the other 20 human ships appeared. They had been hiding behind the dark side of the moon, running completely silent, with all systems powered down, invisible to sensors. They came around the moon's edge like a door swinging open, and slammed into the back of the stretched-out Kael formation. At the same time, the 20 ships that had been retreating suddenly turned and attacked from the front. The Kael were caught between two forces in a zone where their ships could not maneuver freely. Their rigid formation, designed for frontal assault, had no answer for an attack from two directions at once. Officers on the lower-ranked ships waited for orders from Voron's flagship, because that was how the Kael fought. The leader decided. The rest obeyed. But Voron was at the front of the formation, dealing with the ships that had turned on him, and his orders took precious seconds to reach the ships at the back. In those seconds, Nari's rear group tore through a dozen Kael warships. The battle lasted 9 hours. 9 hours of fire and metal, and the silent flash of explosions in the vacuum of space. Nari commanded from the bridge of the Bektu, her voice calm and steady the entire time, issuing orders that her captains followed, not because they were told to, but because they trusted her, and because the orders were brilliant. She moved her ships like fingers on a hand, each one knowing its role, each one adapting when the situation changed. The Kael fought hard. They were not cowards, and they were not weak. Their ships were powerful, and their soldiers were fierce, but they could not adapt. Every time Nari changed tactics, they responded with the same answer: push forward, hit harder, follow the leader. And every time, Nari found a way to use that rigidity against them. By the 7th hour, 140 Kael ships were destroyed or disabled. The remaining 60 had scattered, their formation broken, their chain of command shattered. The iron jaw was drifting, its engines dead, its hull torn open in 3 places. Nari looked at the tactical display and took a slow breath. "Prepare boarding teams," she said. "I want Vorin alive." The Marine team breached the iron jaw through a damaged airlock on the port side. They moved through dark corridors lit only by emergency lights, past Kale crew members who were dead or dying or too injured to fight. They found Vorin in his command chamber, standing in the center of the room, his 4 arms at his sides, his mandibles still. He was waiting. When Nari entered, he looked at her. She was half his size. Her armor was scarred from the battle. She held a rifle in her hands, but it was pointed at the floor. "Do it," Vorin said. His voice through the translator was flat and empty. "Kill me. That is what victors do." Nari looked at him for a long moment. Then she lowered her rifle further and said, "No. That is what you do. We are not you." She ordered her team to take him into custody. As they led him away, Vorin turned his massive head and looked back at her with an expression that the translator could not read, but that anyone who had ever been truly surprised would have recognized. "Why?" he asked. "Because," Nari said, "we don't bargain with killers, but we don't become them either." The battle footage reached the Galactic Council within hours. Every species watched it. The military powers, who had looked at humanity with amusement for 12 years, watched it with something very different on their faces now. The small species, who had stood in silence during the council session, watched it, and for the first time in centuries, they felt something they had almost forgotten. It was a small thing, no bigger than a seed, but it was the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. It was hope. On Aethys Prime, Trade Legate Desori watched the footage alone in his private quarters. He watched it twice. Then he began deleting files. A message arrived on Dohan's personal channel from High Arbiter Oluan. It read, "The High Arbiter requests an urgent private audience with the human ambassador at the earliest convenience." Dohan read the message and typed his reply. "The ambassador will receive the High Arbiter at humanity's convenience, not the other way around." It was the first time in the history of the Galactic Council that a junior species had made the Arbiter wait. Dohan sent the message and turned off his screen, and allowed himself, for the first time in months, to close his eyes. 3 weeks after the Battle of Duri 3, the Galactic Council met again, and everything was different. The chamber looked the same, the seats were the same, the lights were the same, but the air in the room had changed in a way that everyone could feel, and no one could name. It was as if the walls themselves had shifted a few degrees, and nothing quite fit the way it used to. The small species had organized. In the days following the battle, the Suran, the Boru, the Asani, the Vrali, and 4 others had formed a coalition. They called it the Dohan Compact, named after the human ambassador, which embarrassed Dohan greatly, but which he could not stop, because the name had spread across 100 worlds before anyone asked his permission. The Compact was not a military alliance. It was something simpler, and in some ways more powerful. It was a group of small voices that had decided, together, to stop being quiet. They had one demand: reform the Charter of Protected Species. Not the polite kind of reform, where a committee meets for 10 years and changes a few words. Real reform. Enforcement. Consequences. The kind of reform that meant if someone burned a colony to the ground, there would be an actual response, and not just a bargain that rewarded the attacker. High Arbiter Olun sat on his raised platform and watched the chamber fill with a feeling that he had not experienced in a very long time. It was the feeling of losing control. For centuries, his role had been to manage the balance of power between the strong and keep the weak quiet enough that nothing ever truly changed. He was good at it. He had maintained order across thousands of worlds, for longer than most species had existed. But order, he was beginning to realize, was not the same thing as peace. It was just the absence of loud objections. The session opened, and Do-hwan took the floor. But he did not do what anyone expected. He did not demand punishment for the Kael. He did not ask for territory, or compensation, or revenge. Instead, he asked the council's permission to bring a witness before the assembly. The witness was Commander Vorin. A ripple of shock moved through the chamber when Vorin entered. He was escorted by 2 human guards, who looked absurdly small next to him, but he walked between them without resistance. He was thinner than he had been 3 weeks ago. Not from starvation or mistreatment. Do-hwan had made sure of that. Vorin had been given food and medical care and a room with a window that looked out at the stars. No one had tortured him. No one had threatened him. No one had even raised their voice. And that was the thing that had broken him. Vorin had spent his entire life in a world where strength was the only law. You took what you could, and you crushed what you could not take. When you lost, you expected to be destroyed, because that was what losing meant. He had been ready to die on the Iron Jaw. He had been ready for pain and humiliation, and all the things that victors did to the defeated in every war the Kyle had ever fought. Instead, the humans had given him a window. He stood on the central platform where Do-hwan had stood 3 weeks earlier, and the circle of light fell on him the same way. He was the largest being who had ever stood on that platform. He was also, in that moment, the smallest. He spoke. His voice was rough and heavy through the translator, and for the first time anyone could remember, a Kyle commander was not giving orders. He was telling the truth. He told the council about the Malek Consortium. He told them about the secret contracts between the Kyle Dominion and Desori's trade networks. He explained how the consortium funded the raids, provided coordinates of vulnerable colonies, and purchased the harvested biological materials at agreed prices. He provided data files, transaction records, communication logs, and the coordinates of 6 processing facilities hidden in neutral space where the stolen material was refined and sold. Every raid I carried out, Vorin said, was a business transaction. Desori placed the order. I filled it. The council looked the other way. That was the system. The chamber was silent. Not the shocked silence of 3 weeks ago. A different kind. The heavy, sick silence of a room that was hearing something it had always known, but had never been forced to say out loud. All eyes turned to Desori's section. His seat was empty. He had left the station an hour before the session began, boarding a private ship bound for Consortium space. He had been deleting files for days. He thought he had time. He did not. A Saran patrol ship and 2 human cruisers intercepted his vessel before it cleared the Aethys system. Envoy Pilon had coordinated the intercept personally. When Desori's ship was brought back to the station and he was escorted into the chamber in restraints, Pilon was standing at the entrance, waiting for him. She was small enough that Desori could have stepped over her. But she looked up at him with those large dark eyes and said nothing. And Desori, for the first time in his long and profitable life, looked away. For the first time in galactic history, a major power was being held accountable. Not by a stronger power, not by military force, but by the collective decision of the smallest voices in the room, backed by a species that had been a member for only 12 years and had already changed everything. Later that day, Olun met with Do-hwan in a private chamber. The room was small and plain, nothing like the grand halls where the Arbiter usually conducted business. Olun had asked for the meeting, and Do-hwan had agreed, because he believed that even the people who had failed you deserved a chance to understand why. Olun stood by the window, his crystal body catching the starlight and splitting it into soft colors that moved across the walls. He was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, smaller, more honest. I have a question, Olun said. How did you know? When you said those words in the chamber, when you refused the bargain, you had no army behind you. You had 40 ships against 200. You had no allies. The small species had not yet stood. You were alone. How did you know they would stand with you? Dahwan looked at the old crystal being and shook his head slowly. I did not know, he said. I had no idea if anyone would stand. I thought we might be completely alone. Then why did you do it? Dohan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, where I come from, you do the right thing even when you stand alone. Especially when you stand alone. Because if you only do the right thing when it is safe, then it is not courage. It is just convenience. Olun's light flickered. Your species is very young, he said softly. Yes, Dohan agreed. But we remember things. We remember every time we failed to stand up. And we carry that weight with us so that the next time we do not fail again. The reforms passed. Not quickly and not without resistance, but they passed. The Charter of Protected Species was rewritten with real enforcement mechanisms. A joint defense coalition was created, co-chaired by humanity and the Suran, open to any species that wanted to join. The concept of junior species was formally abolished. Every member world received one voice and one vote, and no voice counted more than another. It was not perfect. Nothing built by living beings ever is. But it was honest, and that was more than the galaxy had managed in a very long time. 1 month later, a memorial was held in the Grand Chamber for the 40,000 humans who had died in the Kale raids. Delegates from across the galaxy attended, filling the seats to the highest tiers. The central platform was covered in flowers from 30 different worlds, brought by species who had never met a human, but who had heard the story and wanted to show that they understood. Shinunji was asked to speak. She did not want to. She told Dohwan that she was a medic, not a speaker, and that standing in front of thousands of aliens terrified her more than any battlefield. Dohwan told her that was exactly why she should do it. She stood on the platform in the circle of light, the same spot where Dohwan had spoken his 7 words, and where Vorin had spoken his confession. She wore her uniform. Her hands were shaking slightly. She held a small datapad. I am not going to talk about politics, she said. I am not going to talk about treaties or reforms or coalitions. I am going to read you some names. She read 13 names, the names of the survivors she had pulled from the ruins of Colony Hana 7. She read each one slowly and clearly, and after each name she paused and let the silence hold it. When she finished, she looked up at the chamber and said, We did not fight for power. We did not fight for territory. We did not fight because we are stronger or smarter or better. We fought because every single one of these names mattered to us. Every single person matters. That is what makes us human. And if you take nothing else from today, take this. We will never stop believing that. The chamber was silent for a long time after she stepped down. Many species had no way to cry, but many of them found in that silence their own way to feel what tears were meant to carry. Months passed. The galaxy slowly settled into its new shape, like water finding a new level. On Ethis Prime, the Suran planted a garden as a gift to humanity. It was a small space on the outer ring of the station, open to the stars through a transparent dome. The plants were from a dozen different worlds, and they should not have been able to grow together. But the Suran had a gift for making different things live side by side. Dohan sat on a bench in the garden one evening. The stars turned slowly above him. Tesu arrived and sat beside him. For a while, they said nothing. Then Tesu asked, Do you think it will last? The peace? Dohan watched a small Boru child and a human child chasing each other around a fountain that the Asani had built from colored glass. The children were laughing. The Boru child laughed by stomping its heavy feet in a quick rhythm. The human child laughed the way human children always have, loud and careless, and completely unafraid. Peace never lasts on its own, Dohan said. You have to choose it every single day. And when someone tries to take it from you, you remind them why that was a mistake. Above them, the stars burned on, as they always had, indifferent and eternal. But down in the garden, between the strange flowers and the colored glass, and the sound of two children from two different worlds, laughing together, something new was growing. Something that had started with 7 words spoken by a small man in a dark suit, who had been afraid but had stood up anyway. Across the galaxy, on 100 worlds, in 1,000 languages, those 7 words were repeated, not as a threat, not as a war cry, but as a promise. A line drawn in the dark that said, "We see you, we know what you are, and we will not kneel. We don't bargain with killers."